We're always asked about including deleted scenes on the extras, and we don't like to do that. I always feel that's a little bit like showing you the eggshells after you've eaten your omelet. But as we've done in previous installments of Mission Impossible, Eddie and I have put together deleted footage, work that represents some of the beautiful photography and some of the amazing performances that actors gave that in any other instance would just end up in a vault somewhere. Also, a lot of these, what we noticed in putting this together, tended to be narrative diversions, things that we thought we needed, but ended up not needing. One of the other things that we're going to show you in this reel is how things were shot. This, for example, we couldn't get a crane into this set because it was too heavy. So we had to use a Steadicam, which of course couldn't shoot over the table. So we simply built a horseshoe out of that. And here's the great Henry Czerny, who does such a phenomenal job with his performance. Here's an example of something where we were experimenting with different light, just to get a different sense of a mood and a different sense of a tone. We shot in one lighting setup, decided we didn't like it, and so with just about an hour of adjustment, we turned the entire thing around. And for those of you who like this sort of thing, you can back it up and compare the two, where light and shadow create a sense of pressure. We're constantly looking at our photography and interrogating it and asking ourselves, does this really create the mood that we want? When we were out in the Adriatic shooting with the George H.W. Bush, we had an opportunity to shoot in different lighting setups. We just took an extra hour after the sun went down and grabbed that, thinking we may or may not need it. The other thing is compositions, using compositions to create a sense of character and character relationships in lieu of dialogue. Just the way we juxtapose characters, it's creating these divisions and these rivalries. It's creating an emotional sense of something that supports the dialogue that's happening. And so we created these certain dramatic moments to create cutaways and to constantly create relationships between what was happening in Mount Weather and what was happening with Ethan on the ground. And this is a what if. In every Mission Impossible, there are often scenes where they're discussing about what's supposed to happen, so that the audience can better experience what is happening when everything goes wrong. So these were shots meant to be Ethan envisioning what was going to happen in the submarine. It only took us about an hour after we had shot all the other things. This comes from an earlier version of what was happening on St. Matthew Island when the team arrived before the Russians and were waiting for them to come. There was tension, but ultimately we realized we had to compress the story. And then you have things where there were consequences, where we were explaining why this character, Hagar, attacked Tom. And he gave his reasonings, but we found other ways to do it in the story. This was Donlo and Tepeza saying goodbye to one another in a different version of that sequence before the Russians had arrived. This is a leftover piece of Grace and Tepeza on their journey across the ice. This was some of my favorite stuff, some of Haley's favorite stuff, and we really had a wonderful time shooting it. And it really just created a slowdown in the narrative. It didn't really give us the thrust that we needed, but it represented some beautiful photography and some really extraordinary work by our team that tells a story of their journey to the ice. And unfortunately, the story that it was telling was the time and the distance. And one of the problems with that is the audience begins to sense it. And this was one of the sequences that, as beautiful as it was and compelling as it was, the movie simply couldn't sustain it. This portion of it was actually improvised. We were on our way to shoot some other things that are in the movie, and along the way decided to try our hand at rehearsing this. And remarkably, Haley Atwell, you'll see most of this is all one shot. We shot in this direction and then in the reverse. Haley Atwell had become so comfortable on the sled, she was able to improvise all of this, and our camera team was able to pick it up. So we grabbed it, shot it in less than an hour, most of this, with the exception of some of the drone shots. And it was something we really loved in the movie, but it ultimately just added a sense of time. We'd become so efficient shooting underwater, we were able to get extra material of Tom trying to get into the submarine, having difficulty accessing it, in case later we wanted to create a sense of pressure. And again, Tom was checking his dive computer and the audience saw this ticking clock, something that's very common in Mission Impossible. And in this movie, it just didn't work. This was to create a sense of difficulty for Ethan. And again, loved all of it. But as we were putting the movie together, we just decided we didn't need it. And what you're seeing here is an earlier version of a shot you see in the finished film in which Marie was a larger part of the story. And ultimately changed it because it was simply one emotional story arc too many. And it was creating emotional confusion where we needed emotional simplicity. Here's some brilliant aerial photography from Will Banks and Phil Lawrence, who went out with our DC-3. And here was a scene with Ethan and Benji talking about Luther. And you just realized it created a sense of emotional drag at a time when the story had to keep going. And here was a shot we got before we decided Donlo and Tepeza should be in the third act. And here's the same shot, shot sometime later, in which we added Donlo and Tepeza, realizing that we actually couldn't shoot without them. So we had made that decision after we had shot these scenes in Africa. And here's the aerial sequence. One of the sequences that represented 400 hours of footage, all of which had to be distilled down to about 15 minutes of screen time. Each one of these shots represents a great deal of difficulty, a lot of danger, a lot of coordination between multiple aircraft, a lot of skill from pilots, and always looking for ways to show that it is Tom flying the plane and not a stuntman, which is not usually the case. And all of these shots involve ideal weather conditions and split-second decisions of when to pivot and what to shoot, and a great deal of beauty that you cannot be seduced by. You have to always be looking at these sequences and saying, does it move the story along? And Eddie Hamilton was constantly telling me that this stunt, it was part one of a two-part stunt. Eddie kept telling me, this is redundant, and we're just ultimately going to end up taking it out of the movie. And of course, I resisted that for a long time, but true enough to everything else, it could go. So it went.